Hey guys, and welcome to this mix tips tutorial video. Today I'm going to be teaching you the basics of EQ. Now if you don't know what an EQ is, it's basically a tool which allows us to sculpt the sound of our audio source. So we can do things like make it sound brighter, make something sound more bassy. We can remove unwanted resonant frequencies and boost frequencies which we think are going to make our audio source sound better. They're basically used to try and improve the sound or use creative EQing to create some really cool effects. For example, we can automate a high cut filter to make a sweeping effect which you hear in DJ sets, or we can use filters to make something like it's coming from another room or from a smaller device such as a phone or a set of PC speakers. The applications are absolutely endless, and you'll find that you're going to be using EQ quite a lot on a day-to-day basis when you're mixing your tracks. Now there are no real rules to EQing, just a loose set of guidelines which people tend to follow and have a collective agreement on. It's all down to your own personal preference and what you want to achieve. There is no rules to how you get from A to B, there's only some guidelines to help you along the way to get there. So the first thing I want to talk about is the human hearing range. This is something that I notice a lot of tutorials tend to skip on when they're doing the basics of EQ. The human hearing range and frequency response of speakers are two really important things to consider, because it will actually have an effect on your mixing approach. So humans can typically hear anything around 20 hertz. It's probably the lowest we can hear, around 20 hertz, maybe a little bit lower in some cases. We can also hear all the way up to around 20,000, 22,000 hertz or something like that. When you're mixing your tracks, it's always worth noting that anything above these values or below these values is probably not going to be worth having in your mix, even though you'll see when you're mixing that there's things happening in these areas. You're not going to really be able to hear them. And the other thing is your speakers might not actually recreate those frequencies in that range depending on what you have. So when it comes to low end, anything below that 20 hertz value, you're not going to hear it, you're just going to be able to feel it. If you have a subwoofer that can go as low as 10 hertz or down to 0, then obviously you're going to feel something. If it's loud enough, it might be your eyeballs shaking, it might be your guts wobbling, or you might feel just strange in general. Sub frequencies are used in film and kind of psychological horrors and stuff because they can make you feel different. It's a bit of a weird science behind it all, but generally speaking, when it comes to music, we're not going to really go that low, especially when it comes to club music and dance music, because it's just going to cause havoc. And depending on what the speaker systems are in these clubs and places that you're going to be playing your tunes from, there's not really going to be much point having that content down there, that low end, because it's kind of like having the Hulk in your mix. It's just going to smash everything up, it's going to take up all the space, it's going to cause havoc with your compressors, and he's going to just destroy the overall potential of your song. Now when it comes to high end, we perceive things a little bit differently. You could say it just feels lighter, you have this light sensation, it feels airy, you don't really hear it and you can't quite put your finger on it, but you can just feel like something's there. Now when it comes to speakers, your speakers will have their own frequency response range, or the range of which they can reproduce these frequencies. Cheap headphones and cheap monitor speakers that are like 20-30 quid are going to be no good for mixing on, because they're not going to be able to accurately recreate frequency ranges for you to be able to hear them. So it's always a good idea to invest in a decent set of monitor speakers and invest in a decent set of headphones if you don't want to buy monitor speakers that are going to allow you to be able to mix to a certain standard. When it comes to speakers as well with their frequency response range, for example, my speakers, they can go all the way up to 30,000 hertz, and their lowest value is 30 hertz. Now typically in the music I tend to work with, it's all live kind of rock and metal stuff. I don't really need to worry about going any lower than 30 hertz, so I have no use for a subwoofer. So when it comes to EQing, doing some basic cleaning up of the tracks, anything that's below a certain value, I'll just roll it off. On my master fader, I probably won't go as low, well, I rarely go lower than about 35 hertz. I like to stick around 40 because it's just tighter and it just gives me more room to play with by reducing some of that low end content. If again, if you're working in clubs and stuff like that, you're going to want to get a subwoofer. Otherwise, there's no point you actually working with stuff that goes that low. Every single instrument has its own kind of range and response and harmonic content. So there's lots of charts online which give you a rough starting point, so you know where you can sort of roll things off without affecting the actual tone of your instrument. You're just getting rid of some of that unwanted energy that's going to clutter up your mixes. The next thing I want to show you guys is what these filters are I've got popped up here. We're going to go through each different filter and give you a better understanding of what they do. So these are what we call low cuts and high cuts. Basically, a low cut does what it says on the tin. It cuts off, it rolls off low end frequencies. So as I move this across here, anything inside this green box you're going to be able to hear. Anything outside the green box you're not going to be hearing at all. If I were to play this loop here and demonstrate to you, depending on what set of speakers you've got, you might not hear the low end content, but when we get to the mids, you'll be able to hear what it's doing. So that's a low cut, and then the high cut does the exact opposite of a low cut. It's exactly the same thing. This is something you'll hear a lot in DJ sets. They use these filter sweeps using high cuts to achieve certain effects. The other controls you'll notice on these EQs are these decibel octave. It just basically determines the slope at which, if I move these here, I'll give you a better visual representation. So you've got the slope here of how it gradually rolls off the frequencies. Both of them have these on low cuts and high cuts. If we set these to 6, that's like a very, very smooth, wide value. As we go to 12, it's a little bit more, and then 18. A little bit more natural. It's like a more natural sound. 24 is high as you really need to go. Really, anything above that starts to sound a little bit unnatural unless you're getting into the realms of mastering and you've got a need for it, or you want to creatively do something quite interesting with sharp cutoffs. But that's what the decibel octaves do, the slopes for them. The other thing with EQs, with all the different filters, is that you have this thing called a Q factor. Now on low cuts, where these points are, if you boost it, you'll get like a little frequency, and you can also sort of do it the opposite way, and it will reduce the curve a little bit. But generally, it just gives you a little bell. So those are the low cuts and high cuts. So moving on swiftly, we're going to look at bell filters. These are the most common ones, obviously because they look like a bell. So when we boost, we push upwards. When we cut, we go downwards. Again, we have a Q factor with bell curves as well. So the sharper the curve, anything inside this green area is going to be cut. Anything, we can do a wider curve, so all this information will be cut. So if I play this while we mess around with that bell curve, just a narrow cut, wide cut, and the same applies if you're boosting as well. We can do a boost. And those are bell curves. Now the reason why you would use a narrow bell curve is if you're trying to find a resonant frequency and you want to cut it. Using a very narrow Q allows you to sort of surgically get rid of things without it being too obvious. Sometimes you might record an instrument and you'll find there'll be a certain particular humming sound that keeps reappearing on certain notes, or if just something about the instrument's not quite right. And using these very sharp cuts, you can tame them and reduce them in the mix. You don't want to permanently eliminate them because it might just make the instrument sound weird, but you want to try and remove that resonance as much as you can. just to kind of clean up the sound. And then when you're using wider Q factors, it's more natural sounding for when you're EQing stuff. The wider, the more natural, but too wide, then you're going to be boosting all this other content here. That's the pinnacle of the boost, and then obviously all down here is getting affected as well on these sides, so it's something to consider. The next thing we're going to look at is the low shelf. Now, low shelf is a pretty common thing to use. It's a quick way of boosting a shelf-like area of your frequency range. So low shelf, obviously you're just going to be boosting the low end like this, and we can drag it around. You can also use the Q factor to determine the slope, if it's like more relaxed, or if it's more of a real aggressive sort of like shelf where you've got these little bell curves like a cut and a boost here. The high shelf is exactly the same, it's just the opposite of that. It just works with the high end frequencies instead. Again, you've got the sharp and shallow curves there. You can also adjust the octaves of which these curves work at as well. And then you've got notch filters. These are sort of tools that you'll find mastering engineers use quite a lot to remove unwanted frequency information. They're very, very surgical, and they'll take something out without you really noticing it. But you can also adjust the Q factor of these as well for like total elimination of an area. It's like a black hole. So if you want to listen, I'll put this here. So you'd use them more in mastering than you would really in mixing, unless you've got like a serious problem you want to sort of address. The other filter type we've got is a bandpass, which is pretty much similar to having a low cut and a high cut, sort of like doing this. You can do, well, it's like having a low cut and a high cut quite close together. You can do exactly the same with low cuts and high cuts, but this is just sort of like a bandpass, so you can do effects like making stuff sound like it's coming from another room, or making it sound like it's on a lo-fi like audio system, or tiny speakers, or a tiny phone, or something like that. So if I play this, so you get the idea with what that does. And then finally we've got this other one called a tilt shift, which is like a combination of the low shelf and high shelf, and depending on which way, if you boost, you'll get more of high end and it will shelf off some of the low end, and then if you cut, it will do a boost on the low end and shelf off some of the high end. And again, you can use the Q factor and the octaves here to set how aggressive the bell curves are at these points. And that's pretty much it when it comes to EQing. Those are the different types of EQ. You have got other ones as other different types of EQ, but we're not going to cover them in this video. I'm just going to show you the basic with the most common type, which you'll be using most of the time. So yeah, I'll leave some links in the descriptions below, guys, so you can sort of like do a bit more reading and understand different things. Again, when we're talking about the human hearing range and speaker response, is something you need to look into and consider for when you're mixing, because if you're, like I say, if you're working with a track that's got loads of low end going on but you can't hear it, and there's no point of you having it there because your track doesn't really need it, then it's just going to cause more problems in the long run. So it's always good to remove some of that low end content and tidy up your mixes using these low cuts, which is a real good basic point to start out when it comes to EQing, because you'll think when you've recorded something, you sometimes think, oh, I need to put an EQ on it, I need to EQ it, I need to compress it, but a lot of the time they actually don't really need any processing. They might need a little bit of compression depending on what kind of sound you're after, but most of the time if you've recorded it well, you don't really need to do a lot in terms of EQ, unless you want to go for like your own sound and you want to put your own stamp on something. But in a nutshell, guys, that's pretty much the basics of it. So I'll leave some links, like I say, in the description below. Be sure to like the video if you've liked it. If you haven't, then dislike it. Leave some comments in the box below. If you've got any questions, I'll try and answer them as soon as I can. And thank you for watching. As always, subscribe to the YouTube channel and check out the website for more videos and tutorials and stuff like that. And until next time, guys, I'll see you in the next video.